Hi, we complete our journey through 1 Samuel 20 today with a little story of Jonathan and the boy shooting arrows to try to let David know whether Saul was on his side or not on his side. But before we get into the details of our passage, I want to take a step back and ask the question of what's going on in this chapter and what are the authors really trying to say. If we look back at the beginning of my chart on the right side of the page where I have the keywords, we can look back and see it began with David's set of questions. What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin against your father that he is trying to take my life? But Jonathan's response is, "You shall not die." If basically saying, if my father was planning to kill you, I would know that. And so they come up with a plan to find out how, whether Saul is trying to kill David or not, and how Jonathan's going to let David know. But as it all unfolds, we can ask the question, why does the text need to have this whole business about the arrows and collecting the arrows here, and the scene we're looking at today with the boy and all the drama and performance about these arrows? In other words, why couldn't, especially after the scene we looked at, where Saul calls Jonathan the son of a perverse, rebellious woman and refers to David simply as the son of Jesse and shames and disgraces his son, why couldn't the text just have said, and Jonathan told David that Saul was against him? And if we think the issue is, well, he can't approach him, he has to do it symbolically somehow so Saul doesn't find out, well, then why in our immediate scene, after the boy goes, do Jonathan and David hug and kiss and speak together? Why couldn't they have done that all along? Certainly, if Jonathan and David can speak at the end, they could have skipped this whole business with the boy and the arrows and the whole thing. For that matter, why did we need the whole scene with Saul here? Why couldn't he have just found out, as we see on other times, and we've seen already several times, that Saul indeed had murderous intentions for David and just let that be? Well, part of it, what we saw last time, was Saul distancing himself from Jonathan and basically disowning him by calling him the son of a terrible woman. And knowing that Jonathan ended this scene rising with burning nostrils away from his father. So that at least establishes why Jonathan is not going to return to his father, although somehow he does, even though it's not narrated, because as I noted before, at the end of the book of 1 Samuel, Jonathan and Saul are killed together in battle, and David sings the praises over both of them. But even with that, why do we need this whole scene here? And I'd like to suggest that it's more than just the story that appears here. There are some clues in this story that this story, like a number of other stories in the books of Samuel, is a symbolic or perhaps even allegorical story. And just to highlight that before we get in the details, if you haven't been watching all the videos I've done on 1 Samuel, at the very beginning, when we have the story of the two wives, Hannah and Peninnah, and their husband, Elkanah, and Peninnah has children and mocks her sister wife, if you will, Hannah, and Hannah laments to Yahweh, "Why do I have no children?" And Elkanah says to her, "Am I not worth more to you than 10 sons?" And Robert Polzin, one of the great interpreters of the books of Samuel, especially in the 80s and 90s, interpreted that as an allegorical story that the sons represent kings. And that will come out again way later in 1 Kings 3 when we look at the story of Solomon negotiating the maternity suit between the two street prostitutes and what's going on there. So we know at the very beginning of the books of Samuel, and from at least from my own work in my book, Come Out My People, at the end of the transition to the Solomon story, it's framed by symbolic stories. We also know there are two explicit symbolic stories in 2 Samuel. The one that Joab sets up with the woman of Endor to tell David about Absalom via the story about two brothers who go out in the field, and the one that Nathan tells David to catch him around the Uriah Bathsheba business about a rich man, a poor man, a traveler, and a ewe lamb. And those are in 2 Samuel 12 and 14. So we know those are explicitly symbolic stories. And the one at the beginning about the 10 sons and the one with Solomon with the 2 sons are so based on interpretations. Maybe this is also one as well. And to see that, we're going to have to look at some of the details that are hidden by translation and the role of arrows in the Deuteronomistic history. So having said that, let's just jump in. And as we do, let's do what we did before with what Jonathan proposed to David around his conversation with Saul and look at the parallel thing with the arrows here. So what we saw in the scene where Jonathan spoke to David, and remember, David didn't speak in that entire scene. Jonathan proposed it, and that's just how it went. He said, "I will shoot 3 arrows on the side of a stone, as though I shot at the mark. Then I will send the boy, saying, 'Go find the arrows.' And if I say to the boy, 'Look, the arrows are on this side, collect them. You are to come, or as Yahweh lives, it is safe.' But if I say to the young man, 'Look, the arrows are beyond you,' then go, for Yahweh has sent you." But when we look at our scene we're going to look at here, it's different in a number of ways. First of all, he says, I will shoot 3 arrows, but it's very ambiguous of how many arrows are being sent here. He said to the boy, run and find the arrows that I shoot. As the boy ran, he shot an arrow. How do we infer from that he'd already shot some arrows and this is a 4th arrow? Or run and find the arrows and he only shot the 1 arrow? Because it says then when the boy found the arrow singular, but in the end he tells him to gather up the arrows, the narrator tells us that he gathered up the arrows plural. So we're going to have to look at what's going on with the singular and plural. And a number of scholars just interpret this based on this, that there's 3 arrows and then there's a 4th, but I'm not sure that's a fair interpretation, especially since we saw that he changed what he was going to say to Saul, and that made a big difference, especially leaving out the yearly term of the sacrifice that left it sounding equivalent to the new moon sacrifice as a monthly event rather than the more important annual event. So we do need to take seriously these details and note that in our current passage, we don't know exactly how many arrows were sent. So let's go back to our keywords and keep that up here and we'll look at our details. So in the morning, Jonathan went out in the field to the appointment. An appointment, I think, is too formal a word for what's going on here. Hamoed here is simply the set time or the appointed time, a term that we've seen before. Out in the field to the appointment with David, and with him was a little boy. Of course, what he's not doing is meeting with David. That's exactly the point, isn't it? That if he was going to meet with David, he doesn't need the little boy and the arrows. Little boy is further specified here, Na'ar Quatan. Na'ar is the word for boy so many times in here, and we've noted that before as a key word. But Quatan highlights it's a young boy. Is that to highlight that he's not developed enough to be able to figure out what's going on here? There's no other particular reason why the specification of that, my note below suggests. So, Fackelman notes the parallel structure here between verse 36 and what we're going to see in verse 41. And I'll note that here so we can see it as we go. First, Jonathan tells the boy to run or go. He gives instructions on what to do with the arrows. And while the boy is running and going, Jonathan and David act. And then quoting him, he says, the culminating point of the entire dialectic of having to leave and wanting to be together, which permeates the David-Jonathan relationship in 1 Samuel 20. And he reads the scene symbolically this way, with the boy as a younger, innocent David, the hurry as David's urgent need to flee, the finding of the arrows as David finding his destiny, and Jonathan shooting of the arrows as his role in guiding David on the right path. And I'm going to suggest a variation on that theme as we go, but it requires us looking at the details to get there. So let's put this back up so we can see the differences as he notes the contrast, not between these two, but between this one here and the one that will follow in verse 40 and 41. So note here, he does say run here, whereas before he said go. So he establishes an urgency here, and the urgency is joined with the urgency for here, hurry, be quick. So run and find the arrows that I shoot. And the New Revised Standard, as so often does, leaves out the please, which is a very interesting thing here because Jonathan is obviously the adult ordering a young boy around, and he doesn't need to ask him politely, but he does. And as the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And I want to note something that's going on here because this is not the same word as beyond as we see here. The word for beyond here is avir, which is the Hebrew word, and it's used that way earlier in 1 Samuel, translated as Hebrew. So here, it's also in verse 37. Verse 37, beyond you is a different word, as we'll see in a moment. So in a way, he shot an arrow beyond, but suggesting the Hebrewness, and I just want to keep that in mind as we go, remembering that Hebrew was used earlier in 1 Samuel as an ethnic slur word against themselves or by the Philistines. The more formal, polite word would be Israelites. So he shot the arrow beyond him, and when the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called after the boy and said, is the arrow not beyond you? And if we're careful, readers might stop here and go, wait a minute. If he came to the place where the arrow had fallen, then isn't the arrow there, not beyond you? And this is what leads some scholars, like Barbara Green, and I have a note from that here, to assume that the arrows that had fallen earlier at this spot were the 3 named here to the side, and the extra arrow he shot while he was running is the one here. But the text doesn't say that, and I want to make clear that that's an inference that may be possible but isn't required by the text here. So in our second beyond, though, we have a different word here, Vahala here, and beyond, hala, and it echoes in verse 22. Let's look back at verse 22 here. Well, here it is here, where it's hala here beyond, not ever. But it's used two earlier times in 1 Samuel, once for a spatial use. Let's look at that in 10:3 for a second. You should go on from there, so spatial there. And here in 18:9, temporally, Saul eyed David from that day on. So we can know that this word Vahala here, or Vahala here, can mean beyond in the temporal or the spatial sense. And just want to keep that in mind here. Is the arrow not beyond you? Jonathan called after the boy again, and notice the exact phrase twice here. It's exactly the same in Hebrew as well. Jonathan called after the boy and said, and asked this question. Then he called after the boy again. Why do we need that one a second time, except to allow readers to pause and pay close attention to both statements? Because plainly, Jonathan is the only person speaking here, and he's obviously speaking to the boy since there's nobody else there. So we really don't need that. He could have simply said, is the arrow not beyond you? Hurry, be quick. So the narrator has added that for a reason here. So hurry, be quick, do not linger. And as Falkman notes, these words are, quote, for the slave, the boy he's referring to, practically useless and is accordingly intended primarily for David's ears. David knows that any further delay is pointless and rapid flight is indicated. And I would suggest also for the audience's ears to interpret what's going on here. So hurry, be quick, do not linger. Three ways of saying the same thing. Why does it need to be repeated so many times? Why wouldn't a boy who's been hired by the son of the king, after all, he must have been vetted at some level to be an efficient and obedient servant, need to be told in three different ways to hurry after the arrows. And what would the hurry be anyway? The boy doesn't know, as we find out in the next verse. So Jonathan's boy, notice the possessive there, his boy, gathered up the arrows and came to his master, his Adonai, or his Lord there, highlighting that relationship, which really underscores the lack of needing of a please request from Jonathan to him earlier. But then the narrator intervenes. The boy knew nothing. Only Jonathan and David knew. What's translated here is the arrangement, but in Hebrew is et hadavar, the word. And so Jonathan gave his weapons, literally his vessels, making the boy his armor bearer, echoing 14:6. Let's go back and look at that for a moment, because that scene is going to echo here in more than one way. So Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, back in that scene, and that's literally what's happening here. The word for armor there is the same word, kalev, here for vessels. So this is literally an armor boy, and for all we know, it could be the same one, but we don't need to answer that. Go and carry them to the city. We can maybe assume this is Gibeah, Jonathan's city, but it's not mentioned. And then we realize it doesn't really matter. The point isn't that. The point is it's separated. And then the scene ends here almost. As soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap, as translated here, but mistranslated, as I'll show in a minute, and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept with each other. David, we see here, wept the more. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, since both of us have sworn in the name of Yahweh, saying, Yahweh shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. He got up and left, and Jonathan went into the city. And that's the end of our scene. And so what is going on here? As I've said at the very beginning of this video, the fact that they can have this conversation between David and Jonathan here suggests that the whole scene with the arrows and the boy is unnecessary, and there's something else going on here. So let's go back and look at a couple of things. Let's look at arrows in the Deuteronomistic history. Arrows are a number of times throughout the Bible, and as I noted earlier in the previous arrow scene, they're never used in anywhere in the Bible that I could find actually entering into somebody's body. They're possibly being used, beware of their arrows, or they're symbolically, as we see here, about Yahweh's arrows. So let's look at these two passages from Deuteronomy. I, Yahweh, will heap disasters upon them, the enemy, and spend my arrows against them. And the same idea 20 verses later, I will take my vengeance on my adversaries. I will make my arrows drunk with blood. Then on the other side, at the other end of the Deuteronomistic history in 2 Kings, we see in an Elisha story here, take a bow and arrows, and so he did. And putting aside the symbolism there, the conclusion is Yahweh's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. And then finally, near the very end of 2 Kings, thus says Yahweh concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into the city, which is to say Jerusalem, shoot an arrow there, come before it with a shield, for I will defend the city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. So let's look back at that and notice what's going on here. That Yahweh's arrows are the expression of the victory for Israel or for Judah over their enemies via Yahweh, but also for the sake of David. And I note that, as I've said before, Deuteronomy is almost certainly written centuries after the story we're reading in 1 Samuel, and 2 Kings certainly is written later, unless the entire Deuteronomistic history is written at the end, and very few scholars see it that way, although some do defend that argument that the whole thing is a fictional story written after the fact. But I'm not taking that view here, and to be consistent with my own view that Deuteronomy and Kings are later than 1 Samuel, we can't take it that the author of our passage knows these and is echoing them together. But it's certainly possible to recognize that the arrows, as part of something we've already seen, as a symbol of Jonathan's princely authority, that he gave David his other weapons back in the beginning of chapter 18. And let's look at that and notice what didn't happen there in 1 Samuel 18:4, a text which many scholars connect with it here. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and that's the vessels here in general, and his sword and his bow and his belt, but not his arrows. He didn't give David his arrows here, but in our immediate scene, he gives the vessels generically, but that includes the arrows that he told the boy to gather up and has them. And notice he gathered the arrows and came to his master, but he didn't say he gave the arrows to Jonathan. Jonathan tells him to take them into the city. So yet again, Jonathan is stripped of his weapons, but this time of the only remaining one he didn't give to David before, his arrows that go with his bow. So now we can see that Jonathan is completely stripped of any princely relationship with his father, and we saw that in the previous scene, but now it's being made clear to David as well, that Jonathan is saying, I no longer have anything to do with my father, nor anything to do with the possibility of my being in the way of your monarchy. So not only is your path made safe and clear because I protect you from my father, but you don't need to worry about me usurping you, as he will worry a little bit about other Saulites usurping him when he comes into his full power later in the book. So what I'm suggesting here is, one more thing to look at here, and that's the question of where David rose from here after this scene. So it says, as soon as the boy had gone, David arose from what the new RSV has is the stone heap. But this is just simply not what it says. It says Ha-Negev, which literally means the south. The Septuagint has ergob, which is a rare word, but it matches in verse 19, where the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, has even, which means stone. And so the Septuagint is using a word that can be translated stone to match the Hebrew for stone here. But it uses that same word here when the Hebrew says south, suggesting that the Septuagint authors didn't know why it said south there and assumed it was a mistake. But it's not a mistake based on a scribal error, because visually Negev doesn't look like Evan at all. It's not like it's a one character difference that somebody making a visual error could make by accident. It's something completely different. And we need to pay some attention then to the meaning of Negev here, which which occurs 2 other times in 1 Samuel. And let's look at those. So in 27:10 we hear this. When Eshish, the lord of the Philistines, whom David was working for at the time, asked, against whom have you made a raid today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negev of the Kenites, which could simply say in each of those the south of each of those. And similarly here in 30:14 we see he says, we made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites, and that belongs to Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag down. So a whole series of reports later will say David attacks from the south. And if we look at the Bible Atlas again, and we remember the relationship between the city of Saul, Gibeah, and the city of David's father, Jesse, Bethlehem, Bethlehem is to the south. But not only that, later, obviously, Jerusalem is going to be the city of David. It's called that to this day. And the Star of David, which is on the Israeli flag in the city of David, is also to the south. Here, south of Gibeah. So Bethlehem and Jerusalem to the south, Bethlehem to the south of Jerusalem. So with all that in mind, can we read this story as David rose from the south, not from the stone heap in this location, but this is a symbolic story of having Jonathan surrendered every symbol and expression of his relationship with monarchy, that David now rises to claim his monarchical path from the south, which is from Bethlehem, from Jerusalem, and prostrated himself on the ground, not before Yahweh or Jonathan, but to the ground. And when he bows 3 times and they kiss each other, noting the only mutual kiss in the entire story, more as Klein's note, more than David and Michal have ever done, we see the emphasis on their connection together. Each other wept with each other since both of us. And that highlights the theme of threes in this section, which is one more piece in this puzzle. So what all these signs of unity and togetherness between David and Jonathan highlight is there's no longer a third between them, which leads us to look at threes in this section, another thing that the writers are doing to show these connections. So back in 20 verse 5, we saw the third evening, and when we think back, we think, why does this story need to talk about tomorrow and the next day and all that? Why not just have it in one scene? So in 25, it's a third evening. In 2012, it's a third day. In 2020, it's 3 arrows. In 2041, he bows 3 times. But in addition to that, the scenes involve 3 people. First, Jonathan, David, and Saul, at least implicitly that way. And then Jonathan, David, and Yahweh. And we saw that here in our scene here, where Yahweh was such a key character in the scene here. And Jonathan, David, and the boy here, as we've seen. But now the boy is gone. So with the boy gone, it's down to David and Jonathan, who are with each other, and both here as we see. So the 3 has become a 2. There's no longer any obstacles in the way. The only one in between is Yahweh. And that leads us to look at one more detail of the scene that is important here. So let's look at this very last verse here. Jonathan said to David in what seems to be a covenant prayer, "Go in peace, since both of us have sworn in the name of the Lord," although we didn't hear either of them do this, "the Lord shall be between me and you and between my descendants and your descendants forever." But in the Hebrew, it's much more specific than that. Let's look at it so you can see it. What you can't see in the English that perhaps you can see here in the Hebrew, although this screenshot from Bible Hub is a little misleading. Look, rather than just at the interlinear translations, at the strong number 996, which is the word for between here, bayan, and you can see they've tried to translate it to make sense of the context, but it's the same word 4 times and 3 times in a row in the same sentence there, as you can see. So that's to suggest that Yahweh between them, between their seed, literally the word for descendants, forever, is the emphasis here. Having gotten rid of Saul being between them, and earlier we could even say Samuel being between them, although he was never so much between the 2 of them exactly, and the boy as a symbolic between them, now it's only Yahweh between them. And Yahweh is symbolically now between David as he goes beyond Saul, beyond Jonathan, on to reign, as we'll see, over Israel and Judah. But Saul is not given up yet, so we'll continue with the story next time. We'll see Saul's further attempts to get rid of David. See you next.